up, page turners? Welcome to Writers with Purpose. I am your host, Melvese from Written Words Publishing. At Written Words Publishing, we envision a world where every storyteller, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to share their voice, shape narratives, and impact the world through the written word. So if you value powerful storytelling, which I know you do, page turners, do me a favor, like this video, follow this channel, share this video, subscribe to this channel wherever you're watching, wherever you're listening. Most of all, share. We have a great conversation coming to you today, and I'm pretty sure that you know somebody who needs to hear this conversation. So just do me a favor and share it with everybody, okay? Because today our featured guest wrote a book that takes us deep into the power of literature as a force for resistance, identity, and transformation, and struggle, resistance, and decolonization in African American literature after 1960. That's the title of the book, y'all. Sorry, page turners. I said I wasn't going to call you all y'all anymore. W. Lawrence Hogue explores how influential writers like James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and others reclaim history, challenge stereotypes, and imagine new possibilities for the African American experience. So, everybody, let's welcome Lawrence Hogue to the stage with us today. How are you doing today, Lawrence?
I'm fine, and thank you for having me here.
Great. Tell the page turner something about yourself. Let us know who you are.
Yes, I taught for 35 years as John and Rebecca Moore's Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Houston. I've been retired for 2 years, and since I've been retired, I've been traveling, have taken 3 trips to Africa. Um, the groundwork for my research was a graduate degree from Stanford University. I was in the Modern Thought and Literature program there. And the trip to Africa really influenced the writing of this book.
That's great. That is so great. Well, what why did you choose the well tell us the authors that you spoke about in your book, the authors you researched and featured in your book.
Okay, let me start with sort of the aim of the book. The aim of
Right.
the book is to I was interested in how Black people should become the subject of their own history. I
Mm-hmm.
was interested in how Black people should become the protagonists in their own narratives. Because for a very long time, all the way back to Africa, whether we're dealing with slavery, we're dealing with colonialism, we exist in somebody else's narrative. And when we exist in somebody else's narrative, we're defined in negative kinds of ways. When we think of how colonialism constructed Africans and how Jim Crow American society constructed African American, we were inferior, we were primitive, we didn't know logic, we didn't know reason, we were savage, we were non human. And it's against those narratives that I wrote this book. Now, I learned from the Africans how to approach this in terms of a paradigm shift. It was African writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi, and Soyinka who assumed the centrality, who assumed the centrality of their race, who assumed the centrality of their spiritual system, who assumed the centrality of their subjectivity, which is totally different than sort of the way that the African American has existed in this country. We've always been in somebody else's margin. We've been the margin of somebody else's narrative. And when we're the margin in the margin of somebody else's narrative, they control their representation of us. So I was concerned about our own representation. So I was teaching a graduate seminar in my last year, and I realized that there were a group of African American writers from the 60s onward, James Baldwin, Toni Cade Bambara, Paul Marshall, Ndizake Shenge, Ishmael Reed, who reach back to the past, embrace those spiritual systems, embrace African American folklore, many of those systems from West Africa, and they reconfigured African American subjectivity. They reoriented African American subjectivity. Now, what does that mean? It means that when they reconfigured African American subjectivity, we had humanity, we had agency, um, we had but most importantly, we had humanity, which is totally different than when we exist in somebody else's narrative. And so in the second half of the book, well, let's talk about the first chapter, because in the first chapter, I moved through the whole slavery thing. I moved through colonialism. Moved through how African Americans were treated in this country. And I sort of spell out how we are defined in somebody else's narrative. But then I go back, and in addition to these African writers, that I began to see African historians who are writing African history. And one of the things that they're doing is that they're making the African the subject of their own history. They're
Mm.
making the African the subject of their own history. And that's what I wanted to do in this book. And I do it from
Mm.
chapter to chapter to chapter.
That's awesome. Yes, making the Africans the subject of our own history. I think that part of the issue that we have as African Americans is a lot of us don't even know our history, right? So how can
Yes.
you even emulate your history or you know acknowledge history that you don't even know?
And if you don't know that history, then it means that the only space that you have, psychological space, social space, is the margin of the mainstream narrative, the mainstream
Mhm.
history. And we know how they have constructed us and how they have represented us. So you're in the best you can do is become despair, dislocated, alienated, right? Until you discover your own history and your own culture base and your own tradition, then you can resituate yourself where you can have agency
Mhm.
and humanity and
Yeah.
wholeness.
And authority. And authority,
Yes,
because
yes,
yes, yes,
yes.
yes, yes. Well, for the page turners that may not be familiar with the term decolonization, what does it mean in the context of literature and storytelling? So
Okay.
yeah, they go ahead.
Decolonization means it means that you move into the Eurocentric American narrative and you deconstruct them and you exhume from the past those traditions and history that have been repressed and excluded. You bring them forward and you create a new kind of paradigm to accent that history. So it's a way of deconstructing the narrative that we are in the margins of and creating new kinds of narratives that belongs to us, that is a part of our history, that is a part of our literature. Now, I have to say that we've always done that, but not on a large scale. That even during slavery, we resisted, which is a form of colonization, decolonization. We resisted how we were being represented by the dominant American society. And if you don't believe that, listen to the spirituals, listen to some of the slave narratives, listen to the blues. If you listen to the blues and you read the slave narratives, there's humanity there. There is
Mhm.
humanity there. There's agency there. So we've been resistant for forever. And of course, people like Maria Stewart in the 18th century, Martin Delaney, they were resisting this representation of us. Frederick Douglass was resisting this dehumanized representation of us. So we've always resisted, but something happened in the 1920s, in the 1930s. When we turned to Africa, we began to learn about African history and African culture, and we were able to bring that into the literature. And of course, in the
Mhm.
1960s, there was an explosion where almost every writer that I discussed in this book made a psychological or a physical trip to Africa where they
Mhm.
learned that history, that literature, and they're making it available to all of us, which is why I wrote the
That's
book. They're
that's
making it
right.
available to all of us so that we can become the subject of our own history.
Do you find that the authors that you featured in your book have their books been listed in the banned book category and taken out of the libraries and things like that? I went to a bookstore the other day and they had a whole section labeled banned books, and I saw The Color Purple there. I saw a couple of
Yes.
Toni Morrison's books there. I'm like, what? What?
Yes.
What's your
Yes.
take on the way they ban books now?
Well, in fact, in the first chapter, I list this whole group of writers who in the 60s began to do that. And there's only a few, like Toni Morrison, who was able to escape being excluded and repressed. Toni Cade Bambara was not. I mean, she passed away years ago, but her novel was never big. So yes, most of the writers that I deal with here are writers who are not bestsellers. They did not make the New York Times bestsellers list, and they probably are not readily taught in English departments around the country, which is my reason for writing about them, because I wanted to bring them forward. I wanted to accent them. I wanted to use them as a way of saying there's another way that African American can be inserted into the world. There's another way that they can have a vision about the world that is not trapped into the Eurocentric narrative.
That is so true. That's true. So I think it's excellent that your book can actually be used as a tool. It's like a one-stop shop where parents and other educators and anybody else who might be interested in learning about the history of our our literature and really of our culture, they could use your book as a tool to help teach that or show that or learn that. What do you think?
I hope they do. I really hope they do. And it's actually is one of the reasons that I'm out promoting this book, because it was sort of the culmination of my research, and I like where I landed with this book, because I think it's really necessary. I mean, I run into young people all the time who have no sense of having a belonging to a community or a history. What they exist as these kind of traumatized figures in the margin of somebody else's narrative.
Hmm.
And so that is the audience that I want to capture in this book, to say you come from somewhere. You come from traditions, you come from wisdom, you come from these places, and all you have to do is situate yourself into these things, situate yourself into these kinds of communities, situate yourself in this kind of history, and you don't have to endure being traumatized. You don't have to be have an inferiority complex. You don't have to um, be dislocated and without spirit.
And you definitely do not have to feel less than or inferior to
Absolutely.
anybody else, no matter
Yes.
their race or financial status or anything. There's no such thing. We are not inferior. We are superior. A lot of
Oh,
people just don't realize that.
yeah. And we have to be aware that almost all of the institutions within the society work on making us feel inferior, making us feel dehumanized. So we need these counter narratives. And I hope my books serve as a counter narrative to making us feel inferior, making us feel less human, and all of those things.
Yes, yes. Well, was there any of the authors that you researched that really like that surprised you or stood out to you, like just touched you the most out of all of the authors that you researched? Was there like any one that was like, whoa?
Well, I start with, because I make it very clear that for a very long time, even though there was this resistance in the margin, in terms of African American literature, we got some of it in the 1920s and 30s. Then there was nothing. Then in 1962, William Melvin Kelly wrote a novel called A Different Drummer. And in there, he has an African who violates the stereotype. He gives us an African who symbolically has agency, who has history, who has culture. And then it just mushrooms from there. You get Margaret Walker's Jubilee, 1966. You get Ernest Gain, autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. And then after that, it just mushroomed with Alice Walker's The Color Purple. uh, well, I actually list those writers in the book. Let's see if I can find it. Um, Nikki Giovanni, Paul Marshall, Gloria Naylor, all of those writers pull back on African American folklore, they pull back on African traditions, and they as a way of creating a different kind of African American subject. But there's a whole
Yes.
list in the book. There's a whole list in the book of African American writers from the 60s onward who reject the dominant narratives and as a result turn to either African American folklore, turn to the blues. Baldwin in Another Country turns to the blues.
Mm.
Zam Cartier turns to jazz. Toni Morrison in jazz turns to jazz as a way of getting outside of those narratives that demean us. So there's a whole list of writers in this book. But of course, we do know that Zora Neale Hurston was doing this in the 1930s. With her
Hmm.
eyes on watching God, Zora Neale Hurston does not capitulate to the mainstream society. She turns to Black language. She turns to Black voodoo. She turns to to vernacular speech, and she constructs Black subjectivity. This is in
Mm.
1937 when she's doing this. So it has always been there, but it just mushroomed in the 1960s and afterwards.
Mm. Okay, well, out of all the books that are listed, if a high school student was required to read at least one of those books, which one would you suggest that they read and why? Like this one is an absolute. If you are a young Black individual here in the United States, you need to read this book. Which one is that?
You know, I think embodiment of the whole argument that I'm making is the Toni Cade Bambara, The Salt Eater, because in that novel you have a very contemporary woman who um, is attempted suicide. And
Mm.
what Bambara does with her is that she explains to the reader why she is alienated from the elders in the community, why she's alienated from the culture, why she's alienated from uh, the history, and as a result, she has despair and she's alienated. But what Bambara does there is that she has this healer. She pulls the healer from Africa to come in, and she talks her through the repressed history that she's experienced and the repressed history in her own life that she has rejected as a way of reconnecting her. I think Toni Cade Bambara of The Salt Eater does it all
Mm.
in
That
terms of
sounds good.
taking a very modern character that I think readers, young people can identify with, and
Hmm.
then putting them through this healing process where they're reconnected to the community, they're reconnected to the traditions and the culture, and they become whole again. They become healthy. They
Hmm.
become
Hmm.
well.
Right,
Yes.
and how they have a sense, they have a sense of belonging after that, right?
They have a sense of belonging. And of course, Paul Marshall's Praise Song for the Widow does something very similar. She grows up in the Gala area outside off of the main character grows up in the Gala area outside of South Carolina, I believe, where she's
Hmm.
introduced to this very African kind of culture and community, right? She belongs to that community. Then she moves to New York and she gets married and they adopt the American dream and they get money and they move to the suburbs. And then when her husband dies, she starts taking these pleasure trips to the Caribbean.
Mm.
And what Marsha makes very clear is that it's very clear that she's not healthy. So while she's in the care in Martinique, she begins to hear language that reminds her of her early childhood.
Mm.
And she initially moves to reject it because she's happy with her house in North White Plains, New York. But it's a unraveling of the people that she meets in the Caribbean that leads her back to that connection to the Gala people off of the island of South Carolina, which leads her back to connections with Africa. So something very similar happens with that connection.
Right. Right. Well, what do you think that the modern day authors could learn from the authors that are featured in your book that could help them exemplify and uh, represent African Americans in a positive light in their writing? What can they glean off of these authors?
Oh, that's a very dangerous question. That's a very dangerous question because one of the things
Wow.
that I talk about is most of our contemporary African American writers come to these writers, these workshops and these creative writing programs on these campuses, and they're not interested in the kind of fiction
Mm,
about reaching back, or they're not even interested in fiction that is social or political. They're interested in fiction that is about the individual.
mm,
So it becomes very difficult for contemporary African American writers to write this kind of fiction, but they should write it. They need to read Ishmael Reed. They need to read Toni Cade Bambara. They need to read Toni Morrison. They need to read Alice Walker. They need to read Ndizake Shange, because all of those writers are upfront about their being political. Political simply means that I'm going to deal with these larger social issues that impinge upon my life. So they need to read those 60s writers and the many of the writers that I mentioned in this book, and then go off and write fiction that ignores the workshops.
mm. Okay, that's right. Yeah, you can. It's nothing wrong. Okay, listen to me, all you aspiring authors out there. There is absolutely nothing wrong with going against the norm. Okay, there is
Yes,
nothing set in stone. And one of the great things that you can do, one of the great powers that we have as authors, is we have the ability to reshape the narrative, to shape it the way that we want it to be seen, to represent the way we want to be representative. You do not have to go with the status quo. You don't have to do that. And that's great. That is great. So what advice would you give to these aspiring authors out there who are having a trouble finding their voice and trusting their own voice, who may want to go ahead and step outside the box and shape their own narrative, but may be afraid of the backlash or the feedback, especially nowadays? With seems like everybody's just oversensitive, and you know nobody wants to just speak their mind because they're afraid of what somebody else is going to say or think about them speaking the truth. What advice do
right.
you have for those authors that are afraid so they could just go ahead and be bold and step out?
I say to them, when you buy the New Yorker's narrative about what literature is, and you give your right into that, the possibility of becoming one of those kind of best-selling writers are very slim, are very slim. So what you need to do is not worry about bestsellers. Toni Cade Bambara didn't worry about bestsellers. Ishmael Reed didn't worry about bestsellers. You're compassionate about your writing and what you want to say and what you want to do. And you can get published. There are all kinds of independent presses that will publish you. But if you want to sell 1 million copies, you can take that route, but more than likely, you're not going to sell. You're not going to be successful at that.
Mm,
And I would challenge them by saying, give me the authors who do that. Give me the name of the contemporary Black authors who write that commercial kind of fiction that is embraced by the New York Times and other places, and they sell a lot of copies.
okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to confess here that I am in the process of shaping the narrative and breaking that process. I'm aiming for the New York Times bestsellers list. I am currently refining my woman's fiction novel, which relies heavily on a positive image of Black America. Okay, of professionals and a culture where Black people are, live together in peace with no violence and things of that nature. And
Yes.
I'm aiming for the New York Times bestsellers list because I want 1 million people to read a good story about African Americans, about Black people. So I believe that even though it goes against the norm, where there's a will, there's a way, and
I agree with you, and Toni Morrison is an example of that. When Toni Morrison began to write fiction in the late '60s and the early '70s, she was heavily criticized because there were no white people in her novels. And she was every interview that she would do, and she was says, "I'm more concerned about the community. I'm concerned about how Black people deal with each other, right?" And she was successful, but she also said in an interview, "You can't have five Toni Morrisons."
That's true. That is so true. But you know what? It's time. It's time for us to change that. It's time for African American writers to step up and be bold and step out and demand our presence. Demand that we are represented and that we are, you know, our stories are shared with everybody, not just the African American community, because other people we live with us and they need to know us and how we operate and how we think and where we come from and what we've been through and why we are where we are and why we do what we do the way that we do it. There's a reason behind all of that, and I think that that's knowledge that everyone should have, no matter what their background or their nationality, their race.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And I think the possibility of having that now is much greater given the internet, given these phones, given uh, all of these Facebook. I mean, we can now sell books on these platforms, which was not there before. So I think you're right. We do it. We be bold because we did it in music. I mean, when you think about there was a time when black musicians or black albums and CDs were not being played in mainstream, and black musicians forced the issue. I
Mhm.
remember when Michael Jackson could not be played on MTV, right? He
Mm.
forced the issue. So we can force the issue. Absolutely, we can force the issue.
Yes, yes, we can absolutely force the issue. All right, page turn as well. Struggle, resistance, and decolonization in African American literature after 1960 by W. Lawrence Hogue is available wherever books are sold. I would encourage you to go out there, get a copy, purchase a copy for a friend or a family member or a neighbor, anybody who you know will benefit from reading this story and embracing all of this great history that Lawrence has shared with us. I mean, you went to Africa, you really took some time to deep dive and do your research and make sure that you compiled all of this information for us right here in one book, y'all. Go out and grab it. Here's a comment from one of our readers here. Irvin Mosby says, Mr. Hogue is a great historian. Yes, he has picked up that you are a great historian. So you all go out there and you grab this book. Is there anything else that you would like to tell the audience before we leave today?
Yes, I'll just make one final comment. I think the most revolutionary thing that we can do, whether we're historians, whether we're critics, whether we're writers, is to become the subject of our own history, to become the protagonist in our own narratives. Because it's only by becoming the subject of our own history do we have agency and complexity and humanity.
Mm, mm. There you go, y'all. We have to become the subjects of our own story so we can have agency, complexity, and humanity. I see it now. They're trying to dehumanize the African Americans in America now and take us back to before we were quote unquote humans. We ain't going for it. We're not going there. We're not agreeing with it, and we are not accepting that narrative. Okay, y'all. Okay, there's one more question before we go. Irvin would like to
Okay.
know, what country in Africa did you go to when you were doing your research?
Um, Between 2020 and 2025, I was in Rwanda, I was in Kenya, and I was in Senegal.
Okay,
In
that's great. Well,
2023, And I
Right.
and I just got back from Namibia in March of this year.
Wow. Wow. So for those of us who have not taken a venture over to one of the African countries yet, which country would you suggest that, every African American should go and visit at least one time in their lifetime?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now you have to understand that
Not me
but
like
this was not my
which
first
country. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
this was not my first trip to Africa. And when I was in the early 70s, I spent a year in Nigeria studying African history and African literature. So Nigeria is dear to my heart. But if you were to say, give me one country that you should go to, I just think people should start with Ghana
Mm. Okay.
because
Ghana.
Ghana is ready to receive us. There was the year return in 2019 where tons of African Americans went back to Ghana. It's welcoming of us. Um, and, Du Bois is there. The I remember when I went there in 2072, I visited the slave castles down in Elmina, which was just a heart wrenching experience for me. So I would say Ghana,
Mm.
but
Ghana.
if you don't stop there, go to Kenya, go to Senegal. I had absolutely wonderful experiences in all of those countries.
Awesome, awesome. Well, that's great, y'all. Yeah, go to Ghana and then go to Kenya and go to Senegal. Just explore all 54 countries in Africa. Just because there's all different, cultures. And yeah, just take a tour. Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much, Lawrence, for being a guest on Writers with Purpose. And, I really, really hope and pray that the page turners got something out of this conversation. And don't forget what I said, page turners, share, 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 share. Everybody needs to hear this conversation today. Okay. And then y'all go out and y'all purchase Lawrence's book. And page turners, we'll see you on the next episode of Writers with Purpose. And in the meantime, keep writing, keep reading, and most importantly, you all keep turning those pages. And we will see you all on the next episode. Bye bye, everybody.